Support for Carolina Business Review provided by Grant Thornton. Operating in more than 100 countries, our tax, audit, and advisory professionals specialize in helping companies unlock their growth potential. Blue Cross and Blue Shield of South Carolina, where healthcare is changing for the better. Find out how at ahealthysc.tv. And by Sunoco, a global manufacturer of consumer and industrial packaging products and provider of packaging services, with more than 300 operations in 35 countries.
The long, hot summer. It's not just a motion picture, but it's the business picture here in the Carolinas. Welcome back to the most widely watched source of Carolina business and public policy. I'm Chris William, and linger uncertainty around job growth, interest rates, global economies, et cetera, are still reflecting on our plans and hopes for the near term. We will start this week's dialogue in just a moment and wade in on some of those issues. And later joining us again, the CEO of the world's leading healthcare diagnostic company, David King from LabCorp.
Major funding also by Novant Health, bringing you world-class technology, clinicians, and care when and where you need it. The Duke Endowment, a private foundation enriching communities in the Carolinas through higher education, healthcare, rural churches, and children's services. And by Blue Cross and Blue Shield of North Carolina. Who's responsible for rising healthcare costs? Join us and many others in a candid discussion at letstalkcost.com. On this edition of Carolina Business Review, Christopher Chung, CEO of the Economic Development Partnership of North Carolina, Deepal Eliatamby, President of Alliance Consulting Engineers, and special guest Dave King, Chairman and CEO of LabCorp. Now, here's Chris William.
Welcome to our program. Happy summer, long, hot summer. Wow. Deepal, welcome back. Good to have you here.
Thank you, Chris. Good to be here.
Yeah. Chris, welcome. Good to have you in North Carolina.
Thanks for having me.
You got a lot of people thinking you're going to do amazing things. So good luck with that kind of pressure.
Yeah, right. Exactly. No pressure at all.
Deepal, this is not old news, but it's not new news, and that, of course, is the removal of the flag from the State House grounds in Columbia, and in fact, culturally in South Carolina. And I think the question I have around this reflectively is, does the Confederate battle flag coming down from public purview and public display in South Carolina, does that represent a cultural change that happened prior to that? Or will South Carolina be a completely different Palmetto State a year from now and beyond because of it?
Well, Chris, it certainly has been an eventful 3 weeks, culminating with the event this morning.
Well, and keep in mind, this our program is actually airing about a month after that flag came down, but just for viewers to know that.
That's right. And, first and foremost, our thoughts and prayers are with the 9 families that had lost a loved one about a month ago. And we're real proud of the grace that the families displayed, the citizens of Charleston and the citizens of South Carolina showed. And one of the things in the healing process has been, what does this flag mean? It means different things to different folks. It's not going to solve all the problems, but it is the first step in uniting a divided South Carolina. So I think the Senate took some action earlier this week, and the House went through a great debate on it late into the night, early into the morning, and the governor signed the bill yesterday, and the flag was removed this morning. And I think it's the first step in moving in the right direction. It started 15 years ago when the flag was removed from the dome and placed at the Confederate Monument. And now it's been placed in a place where it can be revered in the Confederate relic room.
Chris, I could ask you about the Republicans overreaching in North Carolina, but I'm not going to do that because that's a whole other dialogue. But I do want to bring you into this dialogue. So let's talk about North Carolina for a second. And let's talk about it in terms of economic development and culturally economic development. So if and Deepal, you're going to have a chance to wade in on this because this is an important point. Economic incentives have been debated in both states. South Carolina arguably has done it better than North Carolina the last couple of years. Even your own Secretary of Commerce, John Skvarla, sat on this set and said that South Carolina was kicking North Carolina's tail. But the larger point here is, would economic incentives even be debated if North Carolina got two things right, education and infrastructure?
Well, I think those are big ifs for any state to tackle. I mean, education, infrastructure, of course, we're talking about what level do you mean by getting it right. I think a lot of companies do come in expecting that there's going to be a solid K through 12 educational system as well as great post-secondary educational graduates who come out and can provide that workforce that they need. And of course, physical infrastructure is key for any company that has to move people or products. The issue is that incentives have really, I've been in economic development for close to 2 decades now. It's the only career I've ever known, and I've only seen incentives increase in terms of their prominence in the decision-making process. When you think about it, when companies are spending 10 million, 100 million, $1 billion on a new facility, they're looking for the best economic return possible. And while education and infrastructure help them get a overall better business climate, it's really the value of those incentives that can improve the economics for that particular decision that they're looking at. And that's why they really play such an important role.
And not to put any words in your mouth, but isn't economic incentives, isn't that kind of the last mile? Isn't that just the...
Absolutely, right. A company's going to start with a number of different locations. They're going to drill it down to what they see as a number of locations where they could really make that operation work with relatively little risk. And then absolutely, that's when they typically engage state and local governments to figure out how to reduce their upfront and long-term operating costs through the use of incentives.
So Deepal, how does South Carolina answer that question, especially in the light of some of the fantastic wins and the momentum that commerce has in South Carolina?
Chris, you know, as a civil engineer, I love this question about infrastructure, and not just the human infrastructure, which is workforce and education, but the physical infrastructure of having buildings, sites, industrial parks that have water, wastewater, electricity, power, natural gas, and communications there, and has been vetted, has been certified, and so forth. And South Carolina has had some success in this regard in the last 5 years, and we've had some very big projects that have announced. And that has actually led to the fact that we need to reinvest in sites and buildings and infrastructure. But incentives play an important role, but as you said, probably to bridge the gap once a company has selected maybe 1 or 2 sites and they want to make sure that they can make their pro forma work. They want a local community, the state, to come to the table and help maybe build a water line, a wastewater line, expand the roadway, provide some site prep work, something like that. But incentives, we've never seen incentives actually take over why a company located in your community.
So do you think the importance, Deepal, do you think the importance of incentives would be diminished greatly, again, to ask the question this way, if we got education and infrastructure fixed?
I think if we continue to invest in our infrastructure, human and physical, I think that incentives will still be important, but maybe in a larger context, maybe not as much.
Every state in this union has the issue of rural versus urban, the concentration versus the farm country. Chris, that has been highlighted as a larger and larger debate during one of the longest sessions in North Carolina's General Assembly history that is going on, and that is pitting the rural against the urban. One of the examples of that is the redistribution, if you will, of sales tax from larger counties to some of the rural counties. And I don't want to ask you so much about that as much as is that a perceived or is that a real debate going on about rural versus urban? And how do we need to address that?
Well, sure. I don't think it's a unique debate to North Carolina. Having just moved here from a state that had a similar dynamic, I know for sure that other states are also wrestling with how do we ensure that all areas of the state can continue to enjoy in prosperity. And clearly, when you look around the world, demographic trends right now in this particular moment of time are favoring a movement and migration of people and industry towards the metropolitan areas. That's not to say that there aren't opportunities aplenty for those parts of our state that aren't quote-unquote urban or in metropolitan regions. I think that's where it falls to organizations like ours to make sure that we're pursuing that broad mix of industries that are looking at where they'll invest in the future and making sure that we're targeting not just those sectors that can focus in on an urban area, but that there's also sectors that we're pursuing that would just as easily locate in a non-urban or ex-urban type of environment, manufacturing, food processing, sectors like that.
I'd say South Carolina even more has the rural versus urban.
It does, and there's 3 or 4 population centers like Greenville, Charleston, Columbia, and Florence that are the more urban settings, and then there's the rural areas in the state. And just an example of that would be most recently, Chris had an announcement in Shelby, North Carolina, and Cleveland County that we're involved with on a project, and that's within 30 minutes to 45 minutes of the city of Charlotte. So companies want to locate in settings that are in proximity to metro areas, but some rural areas do fit better for them.
And I don't want to beat this thing until we get an answer that we're looking for here. That's not it. But isn't just the nature of a rural setting, doesn't it lend itself to the fact that it's not going to have the same critical mass, not kind of the revenue producer that an urban center will? And aren't we trying to remake something here that maybe shouldn't be remade?
I think in our context, we're of course working with companies that are looking at where they plan to expand or relocate to, and we always want to be respectful of whatever those criteria are that drive their particular decision. And every industry, and even companies within different industries, they'll each have their own unique calculus as to how they approach this decision. What we want to do is understand what they're looking for in their next expansion, and we want to try to find options here in North Carolina that best fit what they're looking for. Sometimes those could be more skewed towards the rural areas. Other times it may be a metropolitan location. Bottom line is we want to make sure that we're teeing up options here in North Carolina that best fit the long-term needs of that company.
Okay, thanks guys. We're going to bring our guest on in just a second. As we've spoken about on this program and ad nauseum in other formats and other conferences, education is a key role in the development of not just business and industry, but our cultural centers and our states. Next week on this program, we'll have 2 of the chief educators in the Carolinas. Both superintendents of education from North Carolina and South Carolina will sit on our program together. They are June Atkinson from North Carolina and Molly Spearman from South Carolina together. And then in a couple weeks, he is the president of the UNC system. Tom Ross will be back on this program, not just about higher education, but all things around the UNC and educational issues. With 48,000 employees across the globe, closing in on $9 billion in annual revenue, this Burlington, North Carolina-based LabCorp of America processes close to, and this number is even bigger, 500,000 medical and scientific specimens each day. With last month's Supreme Court ruling cementing Obamacare as a permanent fixture in American healthcare, it makes way for changes and adjustments to our broader healthcare operating system, if you will, changes like reimbursement rates on lab tests. We welcome back to this discussion LabCorp Chairman and Chief Executive Officer, the always traveling and smiling a lot more these days, David King. Mr. Chairman, welcome to the program.
Thanks, Chris.
Welcome back. Smiling because your stock's up, because the market's done, because your revenues are up. But David, not to put words in your mouth, but this Obamacare ruling from the Supreme Court seems to have taken some uncertainty out of pro forma and some business planning. Is that true for you?
Yeah. Obviously, there's clarity now around the validity of the Affordable Care Act to begin with, and also around the coverage of patients who previously were either uninsured or underinsured through the exchanges. So greater certainty in the number of patients who are going to be covered and what that coverage is going to look like is good for LabCorp, and it's good for the healthcare system in general.
So there is a chance, and most likely, that reimbursements will change, reimbursements for payers by providers like like Blue Cross Blue Shield or others. How does a reimbursement change? How do you plan for a reimbursement change for a test?
I think the biggest thing that we've seen over the last 2 to 3 years has been a philosophy that the way to change the cost structure of healthcare is just to keep cutting provider reimbursement. Mm-hmm. And what we're learning is if you just keep cutting the amount that you pay people, you don't, as long as it's a volume-based system, you're not changing the cost curve. So what we're seeing now is the government and the private payers are increasingly moving to what they refer to as either value-based or bundled reimbursement. Mm-hmm. I was just reading last night that CMS for Medicare is in 75 geographies will be starting a bundled reimbursement for hip knee replacement. And what that
And
will
see,
do
I'm
is-
sorry, David, CMS
Sure.
is Centers for Medicare
Yes,
and Medicare Services.
basically the government that funds the Medicare administers the Medicare program. Sorry, and so the hospital that does a hip or knee replacement will now be responsible for the progress of that patient over a 90-day period, starting from pre-surgery all the way to post-surgery and rehab. And what that means is that if the patient doesn't have a good outcome, they'll be penalized from a payment perspective. So our reimbursement is increasingly going to be tied to value delivered and patient outcomes as opposed to a fee for providing a particular service. And it is difficult to plan for, sort of like being the weatherman. You know you're going to be wrong, but everybody sort of expects it. But it is difficult to plan for, but we know that that reimbursement structure is changing fundamentally, and it's very important for us to continue to emphasize the value of the service that we provide through the clinical laboratory.
Yeah. Deepal?
David, over the past short 9 years, you've been able to grow your company from 24,000 employees to 48,000 in a very difficult time. What has been the keys to your success?
First of all, obviously some of that growth has been through acquisition. So we've focused on how do we complement our geographic footprint, how do we complement our test menu, how do we complement our capabilities. When I started at LabCorp, we were about 24,000 employees. We were mostly a US and Canada-based company. Now we're about 48,000 employees, and we do business in 40 countries. So much of that has been through acquisition. The other has been through, we have placed a major focus on scientific leadership. So we differentiate ourselves in the industry through the development of new testing, through the implementation of new technologies, and through our key partnerships with the managed care organizations and physicians. And that has allowed us to continue to grow in a way that is we've probably outgrown the broader industry.
Which brings up, and just a quick follow-up, excuse me, Chris. And it's interesting, seems to be a critical mass of contract research organizations, contract research organizations, or CROs, in the triad and the triangle area. Quintiles comes to mind, PRA, others. Are you outstripping their growth, or is this the industry growing?
So part of it is the industry growing, and clearly in the laboratory part of that industry, Covance, which we acquired, and our clinical trials business has outstripped the industry growth. But the industry is growing because the large pharmaceutical companies want to change fixed cost to variable cost, so they want to outsource some R&D, they want to outsource the actual running and monitoring of trials. And also because right now the biopharma funding cycle is terrific. And so biopharma typically has an idea. They don't have a lot of people, they don't have a lot of infrastructure capabilities. So the more biopharma gets funded and the more biopharma wants to do development, the more the CRO business is going to continue to grow.
Yeah. Okay, Chris, thanks. I didn't mean to interrupt.
Sure, absolutely. Well, I was hoping one of the keys to success would be your home is in North Carolina, but in all seriousness, I always like to ask, what do you tell other CEOs when you are traveling and that you meet at industry conferences or just business associations? What do you tell them about the experience of doing business here in North Carolina and calling this your home?
Well, I want to be clear because part of your very interesting earlier discussion was rural versus urban. So our headquarters is in Burlington, which is much more rural than urban, although it's nicely positioned between Raleigh and Greensboro. And we've been headquartered there for almost 45 years of our existence through multiple structures. Part of our success has been our headquarters in North Carolina. We had 5 years ago, 42 billing locations spread all around the country from California to New York. We've consolidated all of that into Greensboro because of the availability of space, the supporting infrastructure, the affordability for the people who work for us. So we've been, I think the economic environment in North Carolina has been very favorable and it's certainly been a strong contributor to our growth.
That's great. Well, we appreciate your investment that you keep.
Absolutely.
Deepal.
David, one of the trends we've been seeing is merger and acquisition of hospitals. There's fewer owners of hospitals, and also we're seeing emerging technology, could be even considered disruptive technology with drones and things like that, where today you can order your prescription and one day soon, and it's not science fiction, it's happening right before us, those medications will be delivered to your doorstep or wherever you want to buy one of those devices. How is your company adapting to this?
Well, I think there is no question that consolidation in healthcare is coming. And again, if you think about how do you bend the cost curve, which is the thing everybody talks about, how do we bend the cost curve? One way is you have to have scale and you have to have efficiency. So small hospital systems, mom and pop compounding pharmacies, the competitive environment. Think about bookstores in the old days and the mom and pop bookstores, and then they complained they were being wiped out by the Barnes and Nobles and the Borders, and then they got wiped out by the Amazon. So, there is no question we're going to see more consolidation. Just look at in the managed care area now with $50 billion offers being thrown around on a weekly basis. And we're going to move more and more towards mobile and digital delivery of healthcare. And to that point, I think one of the most fascinating emerging trends that we're seeing is the role of the consumer is becoming much more significant. Not only because consumers are paying more out of pocket for healthcare, but because with pricing transparency, with the real drive to get care delivered in the lowest acuity setting, and with the availability of so much information through the phone, the tablet, the iPad, the computer, the consumer is going to play an increasingly important role in healthcare. So they're going to demand the delivery of services to the home that previously have not been delivered to the home. They're going to demand ambulatory settings as opposed to going to the hospital for care. And they're going to demand from us, why do I have to have a needle stuck in my arm and take out a whole tube of blood? Why can't it be done through the finger or through saliva or through hair? And that's a great discussion to have about how we can continue to innovate.
Chris?
So speaking of innovation, I know as a federal government, the U.S. is looking all the time at how much do we support research and innovation through R&D tax credits, through NIH funding. It seems like there's been a push to reduce some of that type of governmental support. Curious how that has broad implications for you and the entire pharmaceutical industry going forward.
I think, so there's an interesting kind of counter dynamic, which is the government increasingly is becoming the payer for more and more of healthcare, for drugs, one of the most recent acquisitions or proposed acquisitions of Aetna and Humana, one of the things they highlighted was that they were going to go from 38% government payment to 56% government payment, which 5 years ago, nobody wanted 56% government payment, but now, the government is increasingly becoming the payer of choice for services because there's certainty and there's some stability. And even the managed care organizations want the government to pay. On the other side, it's harder and harder to get NIH grants. Mm-hmm. The regulatory environment is becoming, from my perspective, increasingly resistant to the kind of innovation that's been done in the past. So there's much more resistance to labs developing their own tests and commercializing those tests than there has been historically. And I think we have to be careful about reducing the commitment and the investment in R&D, because if I think back to the most significant advances in the treatment of disease, HIV, hepatitis, cancer, these are all largely driven by significant investments in R&D, and a lot of it comes from the public sector.
Just in about a minute left, and this is not enough time. It's not fair enough to ask you a question about this, but still going to get it in there. At this point on the political continuum, neither North or South Carolina has accepted Medicaid dollars for the federal funding side of that. Should they?
Absolutely. Broader coverage is good. It's good for the patients. It's good for the certainty of the people who are providing care. And, it gives the patient a place to go to get care and certainty that they can receive care. And so you don't have people not getting care because they can't afford it. And it gives the provider community the ability to deliver high quality care and not have to be constantly worried about how am I going to get paid or am I going to get paid.
David, thanks for being on the program. I hope it's not several years, and next time you come on, you'll probably be 96,000 employees and $18 billion, but that would not be a bad thing either. But thank you. Nice to have you back.
Great to be here. Thank you, Chris.
Good to see you. Chris Chung, welcome to North Carolina. I know very exciting. They're very excited to have you. And Deepal, you're one of those great treasures in South Carolina, so good to have you down there.
Thank you, Chris.
Thank you for watching our program. Until next week, I'm Chris William. Hope your weekend is good. Good night.
Major funding for Carolina Business Review was provided by the Duke Endowment, a private foundation enriching communities in the Carolinas through higher education, healthcare, rural churches, and children's services. Blue Cross and Blue Shield of North Carolina. Who's responsible for rising healthcare costs? Join us and many others in a candid discussion at letstalkcost.com. Grant Thornton. Operating in more than 100 countries, our tax, audit, and advisory professionals specialize in helping companies unlock their growth potential. Novant Health, bringing you world-class technology, clinicians, and care when and where you need it. Sunoco, a global manufacturer of consumer and industrial packaging products and provider of packaging services, with more than 300 operations in 35 countries. Blue Cross and Blue Shield of South Carolina, where healthcare is changing for the better. Find out how at ahealthysc.tv. And by viewers like you. Thank you. Promotional consideration provided by Business North Carolina Magazine. For more information, visit carolinabusinessreview.org.